Welcome everybody. We're going to be kicking off in a few minutes with the presentation, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking about how do you background candidates for office in the upcoming elections. Uh, Albert here is our Whitmore FOIA Fellow, and he's been working with us on a range of projects. He just did a big project we published today, looking at FOIA fees around the country with some great data in there. One of the other things that he's been looking into is sort of what kinds of records and data help you understand what's going on with candidates in local and national elections. And so today is going to be focused on requests you can file, databases you can access, and other techniques to see if candidates are who they say they are, dig into pieces of their background that they might not be so forthcoming about, and other resources to do better elections reporting and just be more engaged civically in terms of who's going to be running our country next year. We are looking to produce a lot of resources around elections transparency next year. How do we figure out how do we do a better job covering candidates, understanding who our candidates are, and also helping build just a more informed public around some really important issues. So if you have suggestions or if you want to stay involved, we'd love to hear back from you. And also subscribe to the newsletter, and we'll continue to put out more resources, data, request ideas, and so on going forward. But again, this is not going to be sort of an open meeting, so you can't jump in with questions via audio, but please do drop questions either in the chat or the Q&A button throughout the presentation, and we'd love to tackle as many of those as we can towards the end of the session. So Albert, thank you so much for leading this session, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm super excited to be doing this. As Michael mentioned, I've been doing some work here at MuckRock, looking at backgrounding candidates for the 2024 election specifically. And that ranges anywhere from local to national office. And here I'm hoping to give you some tools and techniques to do that on your own, some ways to dig into documents and FOIA focused, obviously, or freedom of information focused. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. I can't see the questions that you may have, but at the end, I will do my best to get through as many as possible. And if you have any specific examples or questions, happy to answer those too. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get going. So again, my name is Albert Serna. I'm the FOIA Fellow here at MuckRock, the Whitmore FOIA Fellow, and this is how to background for elections. So first of all, what is MuckRock? For those of you who don't know, and I'm hoping you all know because you're here, MuckRock is a foundation. We're a nonprofit collaborative news site and public resource that brings together journalists, researchers, activists, and regular citizens to request, analyze, and share government documents, making politics more transparent and democracies more informed. We provide a repository of hundreds of thousands of pages of original government materials, information on how to file requests, and tools that make the requesting process a lot easier. So basically, we're a resource to help you. And we also have our own newsroom that we work out of. And how we work with other organizations, which is what we do quite often when we do some of our reporting. We have our editorial team, which I am part of here at MuckRock, that we provide public record and FOIA support for backgrounding political candidates in this instance. This includes submitting records requests to state and federal agencies and producing original investigative and explanatory journalism. MuckRock will also host documents from records requests on Document Cloud, which is another arm of MuckRock. We also partner with organizations and in this case, we work with another organization that suggests candidates of interest to us, and we follow up with more reporting. And depending on the scope of the partnership, we publish journalistic reporting on their platform or on our own, or with their partners. And so that's some of the work that we're doing right now and how we operate. And so we all know about FOIA, but some of us might not know the history. So to understand how to file requests, specifically when it comes to elections, we got to understand a little bit about the history. So in 1766, there was a first right to know law. Sweden was the first known country to establish a right to know law, setting the groundwork for FOIA and public record laws across the globe. In 1851, Massachusetts was the first state to have an open records law that basically stated all county, city, or town records and files should be open to the public for inspection. And this is groundbreaking, right? It's the first time that this happened in the United States, and it was all the way in 1851. Now, in 1977, which is more than 100 years later, the Freedom of Information Act passed, which is a federal law, enshrining the public's access to government records. Now, just before that, sorry, that's out of order, but just before that, the Watergate scandal led to the Privacy Act of 1974, which established a code of fair information practices to collect and govern information stored about individuals. It increased the right of access, and so this built up to the federal, to our FOIA law, Federal Freedom of Information Act. And then in 2010, MuckRock was born. It was founded to connect journalists, researchers, and regular citizens to make politics more transparent and democracies more informed. And since then, we've done all kinds of wonderful stuff here. And so when we think about going after or looking into politics or politicians, we have to understand that there's different types. The three main types that generally get looked at are the newcomer, the incumbent, and then the establishment type. So for newcomers, and this is all, politicians at every level, they're first timers in any race. They have little to no political history. There's a rich vein of new revelations about both personal background and policy leanings. They typically require a full backgrounding effort, and which I'll go into later. But there are a lot of people that they're relatively unknown. There's not a lot of information about them. They generally don't have a lot of press about them. Sometimes they may, if they're somebody like an Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's a celebrity that goes into politics, or somebody well off. But generally, they're lesser known folks. Then you have the incumbent, which is somebody who's currently in office and running for another term. Congressional incumbents likely have been subject to background and disclosures, but financial holdings and extremist/personal views are always evolving. They're folks that we have already been in office. There's some reporting about them done, and we know the basics. They have filings that we can dig into, which I'll go into later, but their personal beliefs or more extremist leanings or what have you generally aren't out in the open. And that's stuff that we can dig into and really look into. And then we have the establishment type. These are well-established politicos who may be incumbents or challengers who have already served in public office previously. They're generally less value for backgrounding, but still important to evaluate, meaning that they're folks who reporters, researchers have really dug into. Think your presidential candidates, your Senate leaders, those kinds of folks who have a long history, many, many years in politics that have had a lot of information already about them. So now that we know that these are the three types of candidates generally, we can learn how to background them. And so what do we need to do that? Understanding what we need is really, really important. So documents that you can get with MuckRock are military records. Basically, anybody who served in the military has a file behind them that you can request from the National Public Personnel Records Center, and to get their full history, when they were discharged, when they were enlisted, the places they've served. Those kinds of documents are key, especially if a candidate claims to have any kind of military background. We understand that there's things like stolen valor, where somebody claims to have some sort of service but doesn't. That's a great way to prove it. Or we can just verify their service. If somebody claims they were a SEAL, we can say, oh yeah, they were actually a SEAL. Here's the record to prove it. We can look at their voting history. In some states, you're allowed to search for the voter roll or entire record of the person's registration as party affiliation. So if there's a new candidate coming in and they're, let's say, a Democrat or running independent, you can see whether or not that's been the history of them for long. And that's really valuable because it kind of goes along with their policies and their practices, who's supporting them. We also can look at property information, and this is really important. If a candidate says that they come from humble means, but we dig into their property information and find out that they own several mansions or different homes, that's kind of going into the backgrounding that we want to see, right? Understanding where their finances are coming. And we can get into that a little bit later. But property information is another good thing that you can get with MuckRock. Traffic tickets and police reports and police records, that's something else, gives a good insight into whether or not they've been arrested, any kind of speeding violations, other kinds of reports. And again, this is all stuff that you can do through MuckRock, our FOIA portal. Marriage and divorce records are another thing. How many times has a candidate been married, divorced? Do they have multiple marriages in multiple states? Things to look at. Again, really key to understand who the person is. Emails, memos, and internal communications. These are really, really interesting and just a wealth of information. Again, all under public record, things that you can request through our portal, and very helpful. So we want to look at the campaign trail to see where we can go and how we get the process started of backgrounding a candidate, right? Excuse me. So the first step is to read. Read everything you can about the candidate to understand who they are, their history, and their political stances, whether that be articles that have been published about them, their own campaign press releases, Twitter posts, Facebook, all of that kind of stuff really helps you understand who the candidate is. And you can build a picture of what their past is, where they're at now, and where they're looking to go as far as the election. Once you have that, down, you can go into more open source kind of research and reporting. Google search candidate's name and a social media site to see whether their presence is like and excuse me, and their possible history. So that could be using things like Google Dorks, which is essentially a way for Google to target specific information. And again, you can just type in, Joe Smith and add Facebook and see what comes up with there. Is it their postings? Is it tags? Is it photos? Is it an old account that they no longer use? That kind of stuff is really valuable, again, to understand who they are. And there's different techniques for Google Dorks, open source reporting that's helpful when it comes to backgrounding a candidate. And I can talk a little bit later at the end as well. So once you have the reading and the open source stuff, you want to look at their financial disclosure. Every candidate who runs for office is required to file some sort of financial disclosure. And looking at these documents to see who's sending the money and how they're spending it is really important. Are they being funded by some offshore billionaire? Is it mostly grassroots donations of $5, $10 each? Is it some far right group? That really builds up, again, who this candidate is, and is very helpful if you plan to do some reporting on it, like actual writing, to build up the background of this candidate. From there, you want to build out that circle. So now we've been looking a lot at who this candidate is, but who's around them now, right? The people in their life. What does their circle look like? Are there any big or suspicious names? Again, are they friends with a billionaire who's jetting them off into the Caribbean, or do they have a lot of friends in suspicious organizations? Is their family rich, or do they have a lot of stuff? Then you want to flag documents that you're interested in requesting. And that's going through everything that you've already looked at, pulling information out and seeing that what might be useful to your reporting from there. Oops. There we go. So now you want to follow the races, right? Looking at different parts of the campaign can lead to great records requests and opportunities for backgrounding. Are they shifting in policy? And this is more for incumbents or legacy candidates. So are their policies shifting? You can look to see their emails, other internal memos. Those are good places to see where they're heading. Look at their fundraising. What dinners and fundraising events are they going to? These are good opportunities to find donations and connections with other candidates. If a candidate has a staunch policy where they're, going against Republicans, are they having dinners with other GOP candidates and they're a Democrat? Are they saying that they're a hard line on, guns, but they're going to dinners with the NRA? These are really important ways to see and understand people. Rallies and political speeches are also good to see where they're at. Who is the person speaking to? Who is hosting the event? What's on the agenda? These are good ways to monitor their shifts in policy or to see what their ideas are. Did they have a rally hosted by the Moms of Liberty and then go to a free speech event the next day? Taking a look at that really helps build the background of who this person is. And then, of course, looking at formers. Speaking with and looking for former campaign employees is a great way to get leads. LinkedIn is such a valuable resource for this. It really can show you the wide width of who this person is. Did a former staffer leave? And are they willing to talk to you, give you some insight into how the campaign operates? Do they have a lot to say about this person's personality? Good information, wealth of details to help you out. So again, we're going to go into what is backgrounding, right? Because now we know all of the information documents that we're looking for. So basically a background check of a subject using public records. A good quote backgrounding is a chance for a journalist on deadline to find relevant public records and historical context on any subject, domestic or foreign. Private investigators and companies that specialize in pre-employment verification, like HireRight, generally have a rule of thumb of searching for public records dating back 7 years. But you can go back decades using the right tools. And some of that stuff can be done through FOIA or other different portals that are available at various agencies. Services like Nexus Public Records are an aggregator, meaning they pull from publicly available portals such as Secretaries of State for land and property records and county court websites in civil and criminal cases. Your best bet is replicating that results on your own. It can be hit or miss sometimes. If you use a Nexus report to look up a person's information, you might get a phone number or an email address that is nothing to do with this person. So always trying to replicate it on your own is really, really important. Nexus also pulls from publications and news articles that have been done. So you can find and see what stuff is there. So what is a public record? And we all have a general understanding of that, but to be more specific, it's typically any government document not considered confidential. So I want you to think about how your daily life intersects with local, state, or federal agencies. Chances are that you fill out paperwork and that document trail is a public record. Go to register your car or your house, you buy some property, those are all public records. If you're involved in a criminal or civil case, nearly all of those filings from those cases are public. It can be as minor as speeding or jaywalking, or as serious as a murder case. All of them are public records. There are some exceptions when it comes to court cases, specifically when it comes to minors or things of a sensitive nature that a judge may create. The word is escaping me, excuse me. But basically make it confidential so that you can access it. But generally, everything else is public. If you buy a solid piece of property, including a home, most county assessors and deed recorders post it online. These transactions can paint a picture of what someone owns. And again, going to your county assessor or your city assessor and looking up who owns a property, or searching by name and seeing what this candidate owns. How many times have they sold the house? Is it part of a trust? Things like that really help build it out. If you make a political contribution and don't use dark money group, the Federal Election Commission, or the FEC, and state and local bodies release that information publicly. The FEC is the federal arm, but each state generally has their own resource to look up campaign disclosures. And this is anywhere from the top of the state level down to the local. Cities, at least here in California, are required to release certain information for a city council and mayor. That stuff is really helpful if you're looking into those candidates to see what connections they have. And that stuff, personally, I think local elections are a lot of fun to look at because you get average people who are running that have interesting ties to the community or outside of the community. And a few other examples: marriage and divorce records, voter registration, professional licenses, corporate and corporation documents, nonprofit 990 filings. All of these different things are public records, things that you can access and you have the right to access. State by state, laws differ, so just making sure that we're paying attention to what state you're in to see what you can get. And so business and corporation and SEC and Edgar records, they vary generally by state, but they tell you when and why a company was created. Most business corporation records are kept at the Secretary of State's office. You can typically get these by going to the state portal, filling out a form and getting information, or you can submit a request through MuckRock. These typically include business name, the date it was formed, its opening address, and its registered address at a minimum. So the picture we're here is looking at one organization, where it was filed, where it was incorporated as, and who basically runs it. It's good information, especially if you're not sure of the candidate's connection to the group, or if they say they have no connection, but they're registered as the president or executive, that's good information to know. Delaware, which is a US tax haven, keeps a bare minimum of information about companies. So if you see that, maybe that might be a good angle or path for you to pursue. Some states, including New York, have more info, a list of officers, changed documents, when an officer is dropped or a name or address is changed, and in some limited cases, business codes, revenue amounts, and disciplinary actions. California is similar. It does have a lot of information about businesses and corporations that you can access. You do need to register and sign up, and most states will require some sort of registration on their portal. But once you do that, you can find the documents relatively easy. And check the trade. What's online isn't everything that's collected. For example, in New York, you have to fax in a request for biannual reports of officers or change documents, and it requires a fee. In California, you can just look that up information, no problem. In DC, those documents generally cost. I think for one project that I'm working on now, I just received a $50 fee per document. And so, paying attention to that is really key as you're backgrounding this candidate, prioritizing what might be more important. If you see that they had a business in 92 and they have another one, that opened, let's say last year, figuring out, is it worth it to get the 92 document and this current one, or is that 92 document going to be value and is it going to save you some money? So keeping that in mind. And then there's the issue of shell companies, or a rushing nesting doll effect. Basically companies that are built to house another company, to support another company that really gives the money to another company. And that gets a little more complicated and requires a little more digging, but is good to know to see who's funding your politician. It's not an issue when it's a publicly traded company. Tons of regulation and info is housed on SEC's Edgar portal, which allows you to search for all sorts of documents, annual filings, quarterly filings, to see what they're making, what information is available, who's running the corporation. So again, good areas to find out who this candidate is and what resources you can use. Criminal and civil court records at the federal and state level are also really important to look into. So if a case rises to civil or criminal, there's a wealth of documents to be found. Court records do not generally fall under FOIA law, but there is still a right of access. And so what that means is that you can't submit a FOIA request to the court and expect to get it back, or a freedom of information request, but you can go down and get those records yourself or even online. So most court records are public. They're visible online in a docket with full exhibits on Pacer at the federal level, and in paper file or online at the state level. Pacer is a federal records repository, which is searchable by district or nationwide, and which allows you to download almost any filing and exhibit with a fee. Pacer is, I believe, around 10 cents per page or per search, depending on what you do. However, there is a really cool tool called Recap, and it basically connects into your computer. So if you're searching Pacer, Recap will take those documents and upload it to, I believe it's Court Whisperer, Court Listener, that will host them for people. So it's kind of like an open source sharing thing. So, but Pacer is a good resource. And then cases older than 2010 typically require a visit to a federal courthouse for a FOIA to the or a FOIA to the court. Again, it's just submitting a records request to them. There's different rules that guide that, which line prosecutors even have to do to get historical cases. So a lot of times, cases that are not digitized are kept in film or have been stored in the back end, require you to actually go down or call them and have them pull the records. That can be a little more costly and take more time. So consider that when you're looking. Again, if it was a speeding ticket or a DUI from 82, consider whether or not it's worth your time of pulling the entire record. I think it might be, but depends on what you have time for and what you're able to do. And then states have their own portals, which includes dockets. So you can go to, let's say, New Mexico and find their state courthouse and see what records are available, generally a search. Most of the time, the records that are available is just the docket. And so to get the full repository, you might want to go down to the actual courthouse. They usually have terminals that you can search, find the records, and have them either printed or emailed or put onto a flash drive for you. And so property records, these are really fun and interesting, I think, as well, because you get to see a little bit more about who this candidate is. Sometimes a shell company problem, but a gold mine of info about financial assets to see what kind of property somebody owns, what kind of details are in there, who owns it. Is it a company? Is it an LLC? Is it a trust? Deeds, mortgages, and other transactions concerning the property, namely homes, is widely available. But you can also find information about cars, boats, planes, and tax liens, bankruptcy records, which lists out people's assets. And it's, again, building out this person's finances, what they own. You can also find out a lot about the financial connections between family members and associates through the property they own. You might see that the home that this candidate lives in is actually in a trust that was founded by their grandmother or grandfather who is a wealthy billionaire and does all kinds of stuff. Or it might be all in the person's spouse's name or the sibling's name, to avoid any kind of financial disclosure. So really interesting stuff in that. You can also use property records to assess somebody's wealth. Generally, if looking at the property value, you can see how much this person is worth. If they claim to be, of modest means, but they have all kinds of boats and yachts and whatnot, that's interesting stuff. ACRIS is the New York City property portal that gives you a lot of this information. But again, your local city, county, state portals can give you that information. And it's really, really helpful. And again, earlier in your reporting or research, is good to do. So nonprofit inspection, complaints, lobbying, incident licensure, and other records are very good to get. They're very detailed, but very specific records for a variety of uses. So nonprofit records are public and filed in Form 990s. They're generally available on Nonprofit Explorer, Candid, ProPublica has one. You could even go to the IRS. The IRS will take forever because they're the IRS and that's what they do. But really good information to see what kind of charities are involved and what that money is being used for. Inspection reports are typically housed at health and agriculture departments on a quarterly or annual basis. If this person owns a restaurant or a chain of restaurants, what do the reports say about that? Is it, have they been shut down temporarily? If they're own a doctor's office or a dentist office, has that received any kind of formal health violations? Good information to have and good records. Complaint information is typically housed with business licensure boards at the state level or at the federal level, or at the federal level, at the Federal Trade Commission. If the person's a doctor, dentist, anesthesiologist, beautician, mortician, there's state agencies that host all those documents that you can find, whether the person's been reprimanded for any kind of bad behavior, has their business been closed, have they received warnings, good information to have, and again, another place to get a wealth of information from. Lobbying info is everywhere and held at the local level in big cities, and then states as well, and at the federal level, and seeing who this person is being lobbied by. There's Form 700 here in California that's generally for city officials, and it lists who they've been lobbied by, any kind of gifts they've received, any kind of dinners, and good information to see. And again, going back to, is the candidate very anti-gun, but being lobbied by, the NRA or local gun clubs? Are they being given gifts or taken to dinners? Good information to know. Incident reports are housed by local and state law enforcement and can be had after open records requests or just asking for them. So sometimes you can go to your local police station or the police station that is in the area of the candidate is, and simply call and say, hey, I'd like to get this report from a speeding ticket. Can you send it to me? Sometimes they'll give it to you. Other times they'll make you file a request, which again, you can do through MuckRock or on your own. And just gives you a good understanding of who this person is. So who's licensed to practice? Doctors, nurses, lawyers, teachers, private investigators, electricians, building contractors, massage therapists, even security guards are required to have a license. And so all of that stuff is public and you can get information about. Again, have they been operating as a security guard or as a nurse? But do they actually have the license for it? Good information to have. Calls for service are also really good. They're below incident reports, but still meaningful. So if you know the candidate's address, you can send a request to the local agency. Depends on where you're at. Some places require that the city clerk keep that. Other, it's the police department, depends on where you're at, but you can request it and see how many calls for service have been to the specific address in the time that the candidate has lived there. Is it a domestic violence call? Is it a burglary? Was there some other kind of incident that occurred that required the law enforcement or EMS to go? Good information and, good to build out a reporting on. And so when you start filing your requests, you want to start with the full name, date of birth, and home address. And you want to develop a dossier that'll require a few key facts. Several states and counties have a voter registration lookup available to the public, including New York City and California, and San Francisco, which allows anyone to search in person at the Board of Elections or search online with a name, date, and borough in New York's case, and zip code. So you can find the person's information while they voted and build that into your dossier. You can look and find where a person lives, how long they've lived there. It's a key data point that can help you target your request to a geographic area. So if you know that candidate, Sally Smith lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, you can narrow down where exactly she lives to find her voter registration or other information about her. Civil and criminal cases, again, inform the bedrock of any background check. So it shows the subject's interactions with law enforcement and the courts and allows for an open source intelligence version of a rap sheet, basically. So you can find information about that, and it's good to know. Some lesser known, but still important initial searches. Sex offender registries with the National Lookup Tool are available through the GOJ. Did this candidate have any kind of situations that put them on the registry? And some people don't disclose that, and you can easily find that. Business corporation searches, again, with the Secretary of State, helpful. Again, going back to calls for service using somebody's home address, it's very underutilized, but really helps build out people who may have had a problematic past. And then you can dig deeper with aggregators, social media, and networks. A few quick and easy ways to build out a subject's larger profile. Most skilled trades, including bodyguards, general contractors, nurses, doctors, have state licensing requirements. And here's just an example for one way to find it during New York. New York State lobbying records allow for a lobbyist and client lookup, so you can see nearly everybody who's filed as a lobbyist to see whether or not this candidate had previously been a lobbyist, or if there are any family members or associates who've are in their perimeter who have lobbied. LinkedIn still requires it still remains a gold standard for network searches, and a premium/recruiter tools are very powerful. Again, finding out who this formers are or what this person's history is. You can see whether or not they're claimed to be, a doctor for 50 years or whatever it be is actually true. Were they a doctor or were they a phlebotomist? And figuring out whether or not they're telling the truth. And again, the formers, right? Who formerly worked with them, who worked for them, getting good information about them. Social media searches usually take the form of specific portal and aggregators based on algorithms, but a few good ones are still out there, like snitch.name. You can search through that. Using Google Docs is another great way to find that. The Internet Archives is a good way. Simply, if you know their Twitter handle, put that in there. Sometimes it comes up, sometimes it doesn't. Or you can search Google and Twitter, twitter.com, whatever their handle is, and find posts that may not pop up immediately, or even specific words. And of course, nothing beats the original paper, right? In-person checks for things like voting history, criminal filings, and FOIA laws. So Board of Election allows in-person lookups for voting history. You can go down generally to see how this person voted. Have they been, voting more conservatively, but they're running on a liberal platform? Many courthouses, including New York State Supreme Court, require an in-person visit for in-process or older filings. Again, these are things like microfilm and anything older than 2010. Some are online, but many are not, especially in rural areas or in places that don't have the resources to digitize every single one of their documents. So going down is always a good bet. New York's FOIA portal, for example, has improved greatly over the past few years, and some return files, mainly data, are available. But again, going down and checking is always important. Various states may have FOIA reading rooms, or even federal agencies have those, that you can go in, look at the actual documents, and get what you might need from this candidate. So state version of business filings or complaint history can usually be found by directly requesting from the Secretary of State or using their portal. If you get stuck and can't find anything, picking up the phone and giving the agency a call is always helpful. Saying, hey, candidate Joe Smith here is owning a chain of McDonald's and I can't find any information on that. Can you help me? Generally, they're willing to help you out. Same thing with calls for service or incident reports. Financial disclosure reports are great for candidates, and lobbying records can be an excellent source of information. They're mostly online, but sometimes not. I can tell you, in the city that I live in, they're technically supposed to have these documents online for the city council. They don't. It's really frustrating having to go down in person, but the clerk is really sweet and has been really willing to help me out specifically. But going down is sometimes the best way to get it because it's not available online. And again, city resources, county resources aren't always there. So I know that jumping in and saying, well, you have to have this is always the first go. Sometimes it's easier to be a little and say, hey, I understand that you don't have the financing to get this all digitized. Can you help me out? Treat people as human, I think, is the best way to do it. At least that works for me sometimes. And that's all I've got. So I'm happy to answer some questions that y'all may have. If anybody has any questions, wants to raise their hand, or if you post it in the chat.
Great. You want me to run through and I'll field questions for you, Albert?
Yeah, that would be great.
Great. And if folks, let me see if I can turn on the chat questions. Folks, if you're not able to use the Q&A, you should be able to drop questions in the chat, and we'll run through as many as we can. So first question, and you touched briefly on this, but is there a quick way to check for military service? A lot of people are not used to taking politicians at their word for how they served or if they served, and so how would you recommend kind of going about checking that?
So there is and there isn't. It's kind of a tricky. I'm going to give you a very unsatisfactory answer, so I apologize. The best way to do it that I've gone is going through the NPRC, the National Personnel Records Center, which is part of the National Archives, but it requires that you have a lot of veteran information. So if you have the veteran's name, their date of birth, where they were stationed, when they enlisted, all that information, you could submit it and generally get something back. It does take a while to get, and the National Archives has not been very good at that. If you submit multiple requests to them and you make a phone call, they are only willing to talk to you about one of those requests at a time. So you have to make multiple calls. So the more details you have about the candidate, the quicker they can get it back to you. There is a way that I haven't tried, but have been told. You simply call them up, give the person's name, and ask for the general dossier. I know that it's worked for some people. It's never worked for me. I've never tried it. I get too nervous about that because I'm always worried that I don't have enough information. So I just submit my requests. Being on them is really, really key. It can take anywhere from a week to, I think I waited 3 months for a set of documents once. So yeah.
Just to be clear, military non-UCMJ disciplinary records are not available, and UCMJ records should be available. Is that your understanding, or do you know?
I'm not too familiar with that, but I think that's correct. I want to say that's correct, but I'm not super familiar in that. All I know is that I've gotten disciplinary records. I've received award notions, people specifically for SEALs, Navy SEALs. So I've gotten a wealth of information. So I'm not sure what's included in that and what's not. So I apologize.
Great. We had a few people ask about, we will post both the presentation as well as this recording later. So if you want to share this with colleagues, or if you have to jump off, we'll share the video and slides, and we'll send that out to the attendees once we get a chance to kind of clean it up and add some notes. So that might be next week or once we come back for the new year. Somebody asked about court records. Are memos between courts and agencies and intra-court records emails FOIAable?
So that depends, and it's tricky. So if a state agency is emailing a court and it's not in relation to generally a case, it is, because any state, well, most state and public agencies are required to disclose that information. So let's say that the city clerk, for whatever reason, is emailing the courthouse about, I don't know, a new building or something. That stuff is obviously public. Or if it's in the realm of a case that they can't talk about, generally it might not be. There's attorney-client privilege that goes into that. So that can play into it. So you can always try at not with the court, with whatever agency. So if you're looking at the transit agency, right? Just give you an example. You can email those communications to and from the court from that agency, from the transit agency, and you generally can get stuff back. A word of caution when it comes to communications and emails, you want to be very, very specific, because they might decide to give you 1,000 pages of documents and charge you up the wazoo for that. So using specific keywords, using dates, using emails. So if you know that it's, smith@court.gov, or, sue@clerk.city, use those emails so that they can search within parameters. And also call the agency too. Ask them what, if you speak to an IT person, and what they would search for and how they would search, so that it can better inform your request.
Great. This was kind of a general point, but I think it might be something that worth just touching on briefly. Somebody flagged that some court records aren't available because they've been expunged for one reason or another. Any thoughts in terms of that, or kind of tips in terms of how you think about what is and is not available?
Yeah, so as far as expunged stuff goes, I think that, and generally that happens with, minors who, complete a sentence when they get older, or in certain, in California, there was a, goodness, it was a drug, I forget what the name is, proposition something or other, basically, that if somebody convicted of drug possession or use got their expunged if they went through treatment and stuff. So stuff like that, I think, I like to think on the human side of things, because as a journalist, we want to minimize harm. And although, a candidate may have a history, a past of, either substance abuse, or, as a teenager, like B&Es or something very nonviolent, maybe that's not a B&E, but, shoplifting, whatever. And they have not been part of that. I'm not sure that matters, but it's not unimportant, right? So considering that, talking to people around them at the time. So if you know that they had an expunged record for I don't know, drug use 10 years ago, and you know that their former friends at the time are around, you can talk to those people and ask about it. They might know. You can ask the candidate directly and say, hey, I saw that you potentially have something expunged. Are you willing to talk about it? But I like to personally err on the human side of things, and be considerate of people's changing. I think that, we're not the same people we were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so maybe give them a little bit of grace in that.
Right. Yeah. And just in the chat, that commenter also flagged that records can be expunged because of no conviction, right? So I think that's another, absence of records doesn't mean that they're actually absent. So that's good caveat there. Somebody asked, you mentioned the term Google Dorks before. What is a Google Dork, and what's the best way to start if you're not used to that world?
Yeah. So a Google Dork is just a way that Google functions on things. it's a search term. You basically write out, let's say, file type would be one dork. So you would say, you would put in parentheses, meeting minutes, and then you would put the plus sign, type file type as one word, a colon, and then PDF, and it will pull up meeting minutes or things with meeting minutes in them that are specifically PDFs and allow you to access it. And there's all kinds of them. Google has gone away from requiring those types of functions in the search bar, but I found them to be very helpful. This is going to sound silly, but if you Google Dork, it'll give you a list of them. There's, I think the proper way to call them is command functions, if I'm not mistaken, so that you can actually see what they are. But yeah, there's just a way of searching Google.
And somebody had a clarifying question. You mentioned earlier kind of looking at voter records to kind of see somebody's pattern of voting, but somebody asked, can you actually find specific candidates who people have voted for? My understanding is you can see whether somebody voted, but not how they voted.
I think in some places it's possible. I believe you're correct. Like seeing how they voted, you can see what they're registered as a registered Democrat, registered Republican, Independent. But I do believe you're correct, and I apologize for the confusion there. But yeah, generally you can see where they're registered, not who they voted for. Those are generally kept private. You could also go around that and do some open source searching to see if they've posted, any kind of support for somebody. Did they have a lawn sign or did they donate to somebody's campaign? That generally gives you a good idea who they're voting for.
So somebody asked about bankruptcy filings, which you mentioned briefly. Bankruptcy filings can be helpful, but there are a ton of docs in a typical bankruptcy. Any suggestions on how to cut through the chaff and what's the most relevant and useful thing to look for in those?
I think your first step is probably to look at the bankruptcy docket to see what has been filed, what motions or whatever. I'm not super familiar with bankruptcies. I've never had to look at any, but probably the first filing and the final filing are going to be your best resource in that. Looking at why the bankruptcy was filed, understanding what information is included in that first document, and then the final document when it's been settled and done, see what the initial outcome is, what amount of how much was bankrupt. I think that the first and last would be your best bet. And then if you feel like there's more, looking to see what the docket says and what documents you think might be important to go for. This is my suggestion.
Right. Another question, is there any online window in to how a political candidate's positions may have changed over time? And they gave as an example of a politician going from being pro-gun to now being anti-gun in terms of how do you track those shifts or a kind of any tips in terms of tracing policy changes?
Lots of reading. I think Google can help you in that when you search, let's say, I don't know, Governor Newsom, let's just throw him out there. You can see, put a news alert for him and see what's been written, and then you can tailor the search by year. So if you go year by year, you can do that. Looking at their filings or statements is good. It's not so cut and dry. There isn't one way to see how this person is shifted, or may have shifted, but it just requires a lot of reading and a lot of time. One thing that I really want to stress is that backgrounding candidates is not always for the faint of heart. It takes a lot of time and effort and energy, because while you're looking at a candidate's background and history in life, you also want to put it through the lens of accuracy, right? You might find an article published that says this candidate, has always been an ardent gun supporter or has voted this way. And when you actually do the research and reporting, you find that's not true. It's just some sort of a weird hit piece or some opinion or some blog. So being very critical and looking into what you're actually reading is key. So it does take time, it does take effort, and it requires a little bit of care, a lot of bit of care to go into it. So unfortunately, there isn't one one way. Their voter registration would probably be the easiest to see, were they a registered Democrat, were they a registered Republican, were they independent, whatever. So that might be the best way. Campaign donations too. If you look at the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, you can search if they've donated to PACs or campaigns and see what those donations look like. Have they been primarily donating to Democratic campaigns and suddenly they switch to the GOP, or vice versa? That might be a good indicator, but it does require outside research and reporting.
I like this question a lot. Any suggestions, speaking of being faint of heart, any suggestions on dealing with targets being notified about FOIA and other requests, right? And if you're looking into somebody, the odds of them looking back at you.
That's a tough one. So what I think is standard practice is kind of saving the best for last, right? Before you publish anything, you go to the candidate at the end. But if they do get tipped off, having some sort of a boilerplate ready, or just mentally prepared and assuming that they might find out, don't want to put you in a state of paranoia, but just being conscious of that. You might talk to a former employee and you get a call the next day, candidate Smith is like, hey, heard you're asking questions about me, and be honest, right? You don't want to lie to somebody. You want to be as transparent as possible. And we as journalists, that's one of our key tenets, right? Is to be open and honest about our reporting and never to hide who we are. So saying, yeah, I'm actually looking into you, trying to get some information. Can we have this call at a later time if you're unprepared? Or say, just lay it all out if you're ready. Say, well, I found this information. Can you clarify? Or can you explain this? They might be willing to help you. If they're a little adversarial, they might just shut you out completely. And then that goes in your reporting. Senator Smith responded, reached out to, MuckRock and said they would not comment. That says a lot about the candidate as well. So finding other ways around is also important, and all these different tools that we kind of went over is ways to do that. But it's a scary feeling. So just wing it sometimes and hope for the best, or prepare yourself, one of the two.
Okay. Any tips on where you would find property records? Any portals or specialized access points that you could flag for folks?
Yeah, it really goes state by state and county by county. Some states, most cities and counties have different portals that you can go. Sometimes it's the assessor, sometimes it's the clerk. So I would recommend just looking into your specific area. If, let's say, in Texas, there is an assessor's office that you can go to see the parcel and the amount, the tax history of that. That's the way to do it. In other places, it may be the clerk's office who can give you all that information. There is no one central, because those are not generally not federal documents. So it's a state by state, city by city, county by county basis. Bigger cities generally have like the assessor's office. Counties might have them as well. So know where you're at, know where this person's at, and you can kind of gauge that. So I apologize, there is no one repository of that.
Somebody said that they're new to federal election coverage this year. Do you know how to access stock holdings data by Congress members, and any other information not listed on financial disclosure forms that might be worth looking for?
Oh, that's a good question. There are FEC filings that are required to be disclosed if the person owns an amount of stock. You could look at, it's a schedule. I was just looking at one today. It was a Schedule B form that lists all of their assets, and all of the different means of income that they own, and that should all be disclosed. It should all be required if they're making income from stock. If you want to reach out after, I'm happy to dig up the document and give you the exact name, because I'm not remembering it off the top of my head. But there is ways to see what a person's stocks, because it does come into their income and should be required to be filed.
And we have a ton of fantastic questions, but I think we need to wrap up in just a few minutes. But I will close out with this one. What about political campaigns? Can you get, for example, a list of people who requested a lawn sign in a particular cycle, or any other kind of campaign related information that's worth thinking about?
Yeah, so It's funny that you mentioned lawn signs because a lot of times those are considered political donations. So if you buy a lawn sign, you get it as part of your political donation, which is fun. So all of the money that they're bringing in is that. So they're required over a certain amount. I think it's like $5 or it's a really low amount, or maybe it might be higher than that. But they're required to submit a list of people who have donated to their campaign, and so the FEC has a list of people who've donated to that campaign, and you'll see numbers as low as like $5 and as high as I think it's $39.99 is $3,999 before they are required to do some other forms. But you can see that all over there. Downloading the documents, and there's usually by year and quarter that are required to be filed, and then entering it into either some sort of like R programming and filtering out by those low amounts to see who's donated, whatever, and going to their website. How much does a lawn sign cost? $10. How many people donated $10, and then going down that list is a really good way to back end it. But yeah, all that information is available because donation.
Right. And yeah, just to kind of wrap up, I think if you were to kind of flag any one resource as a good starting point for people to kind of close out, what's been your favorite resource as you've kind of dove into this world?
Um, I have really enjoyed data stuff, so I like looking at the FEC. It gives you a really good understanding of where the money is coming from. You might see in one case, there's a candidate out in Washington who's receiving money from Florida. In another case, there's somebody in Utah receiving from New Hampshire. And it's not an individual, it's, PACs, interesting names. So that stuff is very fascinating and gives you a clue of who the people are involved. Some people, it's like a lot of family. One candidate, it's her husband who's funding her entire campaign. So FEC is probably like my first stop shop and one of the best tools, I think. Not perfect, but it gives you a good running start.
Great. Well, Albert, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Thank you to everybody who joined us today and who's watching after the fact. We're going to clean up some of the notes and include some more resources and send out a copy of the slides and this video to everybody who attended and also folks who are on our newsletter. But we're also really looking forward to kind of putting together more resources in the new year. So please take a few minutes, fill out the survey. There's a few questions and most of them are optional. So any feedback is really appreciated. Other than that, thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful holidays.